It's the last this term, and a real pleasure to welcome back one of our own, Hannah Ewens, who is sort of man and boy at Southampton as an undergraduate, MA and PhD student, and it's some time has been at Chester, where she's now the senior lecturer in the history department. And she's part of the sort of Parkes Institute in exile on the Welsh border, with Hannah and Tim Grady, Cara Critchell and Chad MacDonald. So it's great to see our influence in other places. But Hannah was a star here, and it's not surprising to us at all how well she's done subsequently. She's published very widely, and her major publication is The Alien Jew in the British Imagination, Space Mobility and Territoriality. Should have realized I was going to struggle at 6 o'clock to get that last word out, but it's a very sophisticated re-examination of the aliens question at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, a really brilliant book. She's edited 3 collections, including a very important one with Tim Grady on minorities in the First World War, and published on another minority history. But tonight, Hannah is going to be talking to us a very topical for the circumstances in which we live in, on borders, ports and pestilence, managing disease during the age of Jewish mass migration. Hannah.
Thank you so much, Tony, and thanks very much to Claire as well, and the Parkes Institute for inviting me. And it's really wonderful to be here, albeit not physically, and a great honour, as Tony said as well, and rather fitting that I should present this paper that's drawn from research undertaken for a project that first began life as a PhD dissertation at Southampton, under Tony's supervision, and took me almost a full decade to eventually get out into book form, as these things do. I got a bit distracted with other projects, but it seemed quite fitting, as Tony suggested, to talk about this, given where we are. But I was wondering today, perhaps everybody is heartily sick of thinking about disease management. But anyway, I hope you'll bear with me and have a little more patience for this topic this evening. I want to begin with a novel, Eugene Sue's Le Juif errant. The novel opens with an image of the eponymous protagonist stretching his arms across the Bering Straits towards America from the shores of Siberia, from the old world to the new. He's a man looking both forwards and backwards in space as well as time, but also a man with migratory ambitions, perhaps, standing as he does on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. And it's the sea which ultimately restrains him, forming a physical barrier against its inclination towards mobility. Yet the lurking menace of Sue's wandering Jew, which this opening scene seems to hint at, is not about migration per se, but rather what was perceived to be transmitted through the act of migration, disease. As the novel unfolds, we learn that this wandering Jew is responsible for the spread of arguably the most feared of the 19th century diseases, King Cholera. This triumvirate of identities which meets in Eugene Sue's figure of the wandering Jew, migrant, Jew and the diseased stranger, brings together the 3 themes that I want to talk about this evening. Of course, these are not new themes within the Jewish story. The association between Jews and mobility might be regarded as the quintessential tale of Jewish life. As Howard Jacobson Riley observed in his autobiographical Odyssey, Root Smoots, where there is a Jew, there is a journey. Similarly, so too is there nothing new in linking Jews and disease. As Sander Gilman reminds us, this is an idea as old as the Middle Ages. But as Sue's novel seems to anticipate, the late 19th century is a moment when these 3 strands come together as never before, facing unprecedented global regulation. Our story then starts in 1892, when reports of a cholera outbreak first detected in Asiatic Russia and on the fringes of Paris in seemingly unconnected cases migrate with rapid speed to establish a cross-continental network of infection sites and contagion zones across Europe. By August, this disease had stretched its deadly grip from the Caspian Sea to Moscow to St. Petersburg, finding its way to Hamburg by the middle of August, Britain by the close of the month, and the United States by September. The spatial patterning and mobility of the disease placed migrating Jews, at that time leaving the Russian Empire, Romania and Galicia in large numbers, in the spotlight as the carriers of contagion. And I want to suggest in this paper that it catapulted not just them, but more particularly the routes they travelled into widespread public view. And this can be seen particularly in the response of one nation in receipt of these migrants, Britain. This island nation was, comparatively speaking, some way down the league table in terms of the number of Jewish migrants who ultimately came to settle there, especially when viewed against the many who strove to reach the United States. But nonetheless, the 200,000 or so who arrived in Britain across the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, as well as the thousands more who used it as a key transit hub for their onward journeys, were the subject of an unprecedented campaign for immigration restriction. And it's this campaign, namely the desire to prove its necessity, which gave rise to the fierce scrutiny brought to bear not just on Jewish migrant journeys, but more particularly on Jews' journeys and the transmission of disease. It's worth saying that even before the cholera outbreak of 1892, restrictionists in Britain were already concerned with the unregulated and even clandestine passage of Jews across European borders. According to commentator W.H. Wilkins, writing in the early 1890s, Jews leaving the Russian Pale should be regarded with great suspicion. These were a people, Wilkins cautioned, prepared to resort to many subterfuges to get across the border. What class of citizens such duplicitous individuals would make, he inferred, was anybody's guess. This promulgated the idea of the covert Jew, a stock type within anti-Semitic discourse. But in a divergence from this usual notion, however, the concern was not so much with the concealed Jew hiding in plain sight, but rather with the act of concealment itself. Here were Jews who, reportedly in their thousands, utilised the endemic continental-wide system of smugglers and agents, bribes, extortions, falsified papers, and underground networks to reach North Sea ports. This rhetoric assumes a whole new resonance after the outbreak of cholera in 1892. And the disease's rapid march across the continents and then its transmittance to North America via transatlantic shipping was attributed to these migrants travelling westwards. Unsurprisingly, the perceived potential for these travellers to pollute the spaces through which they passed and to infect the people that they came into contact with heightened the sense of suspicion which surrounded them. Despite the attempts of the German authorities to set up control stations, transit centres and quarantine facilities to sift, filter and, if necessary, exclude diseased migrants, some British watchers nevertheless remained wary. This from a newspaper article of the time. There are those that are passed by the inspectors, get a card marked with a red cross, and their baggage is similarly marked, and then further they go. Many, however, slip through. Who can say how many escape the controls altogether? In reality, evading the control stations along the Russian frontier or those positioned to intercept migrants once they neared the port of embarkation was both difficult and disadvantageous. Doing so would leave migrants exposed to the advances of unscrupulous agents, to arrest by German police, or rejection by the shipping lines. Yet presenting the control system as flimsy, porous, and poorly managed played into the hands of those agitating for restriction. It presented Britain as the victim of continental incompetence to curb the spread of the disease. And others, even those sympathetic to the plight of these migrants, also showed concern about the prevalence of clandestine migrant journeys. This here, the writer, very, very famous in his time, Hall Caine, who took, during his journeys across the European continent and to Eastern Europe, he took care to point out the stringency of the measures put in place between the frontier towns and the ports of departure to examine, quarantine, disinfect, and if necessary, reject migrants. But nonetheless, he also felt compelled to draw a distinction between Jews traveling via these so-called legitimate routes and what he called independent emigrants. According to Caine, this second group was made up of Jews who hailed from, in quotes, heaven alone knows where, who held none of the necessary paperwork and as a consequence were therefore smuggled across the frontier, sidestepping all medical examination. Once arrived in Hamburg, these independents found some means to beg sufficient funds to purchase a steamship ticket to a British port. And as he concluded, these are the hapless Russian Jews from whom we live in peril. For British journalist Robert Sherard, migrating Jews were more than simply hapless, they were downright dangerous. One sees at the border inspection station that sinister, inverse, malingering, the diseased man who tries to pass himself off as sound. The air resounds with lies most pathetic. His much more venomous rhetoric might in part be explained as frustration. Thanks to the efficiencies of the newly constructed transit corridors, it was all but impossible for outside observers to monitor migrants except for the occasions when they were required to surface for the purposes of inspection. Even the purpose-built emigrants train station at Ruhleben, you can see here, on the outskirts of Berlin, which processed an estimated 100,000 people annually, made every effort to conceal these migrants from view. And as some of you probably know, migrants actually transited directly through the main stations in Berlin, going out to this purpose-built emigrants train station, which was available to them from 1891. But there they were intentionally kept away from any sorts of mixing with wider German populace. So seen in this light then, Sherard's cynical attempt to appropriate the inspection station on the Russian-Prussian border as a site that revealed the subversive and dangerously diseased profile of migrating Jews makes some sense. It was an effort by an opportunist making the most of a scarce opportunity. It also fitted with the tactics employed by other anti-alienists to smear the alien Jew, emphasizing their troublesome traits while attempting the illusion of making European frontiers a mirror for Britain's own, all helped to sell this fiction. By imaginatively narrowing the distance between Central European border zones and Britain, used the fraught geopolitics of late 19th century Europe to heighten the sense of Britain's vulnerabilities as a penetrable space. Those Britons keen to substantiate still further the need for restrictive legislation found much to support their case as they encountered migrating Jews at their next point of appearance, the bustling transatlantic ports scattered along the fringes of Northern Europe. Here, Jews in transit, together with an assortment of emigrants from across Europe, navigated the vitality of the port that thronged with an assortment of human traffic, cattle, produce, shipping agents, dock workers, and members of the settled port communities. But in Hamburg, one of the busiest ports in Northern Europe by 1900, such encounters were severely curtailed by portside practices that sought to keep migrants physically segregated from the general populace. And this was even more so the case after cholera gripped the city, killing ultimately 9,000 of its residents. Through the efforts of Albert Berlin, the German Jewish director of the Hamburg America line, by the 1890s, migrants arriving in Hamburg were herded away from the town and instead into accommodation near the port. By 1900, the site had grown into an extensive 25,000 square metre complex on Wedel Island in the Elbe River. You can see some images that show the exterior of the site as well as the interior, the one on the top right showing the reception hall where migrants arrived, and then also sites here in the vast dining hall, also the church and the purpose-built synagogue as well. This site offered accommodation, shops, entertainment, kosher and non-kosher kitchens, and spaces of worship. Vitally, however, it also orchestrated a comprehensive system of disinfection, daily medical inspection, and, if necessary, the quarantining of migrants before their onward travel. Berlin's initiative personified both the apex of portside disease management and transnational cooperation in the controlling of continental migration. The Auswandererhallen then, this site here, was cleverly conceived enterprise that enticed migrants by offering a complete service of accommodation, meals, and spiritual sustenance, together with the loathsome, although necessary, medical inspections. The efficient system for disinfecting migrants upon entry, moving them, as you can see here from this map, from the unclean, unreiner spaces of the site in which the entrance building was situated to the designated clean side, which encompassed the rest of the site. And you can see it a little bit better, I think, on this slide. All of the area marked A, which is on the bottom left corner of the slide, is the unclean side where migrants are initially received, and then they move through into the B quarter, the B areas. And in fact, if I just go back to the previous slide, you can see the very, very top there, the area marked C, that was the quarantine for those migrants that it was deemed necessary. So this process then saw every inhabitant processed with medicalized efficiency. And similarly, the daily medical inspection offered a further filter operating to sift out these migrants incubating diseases, offering assurances to migrants, as well as, of course, to receiving countries alike, that any new arrival would not fall foul of entry requirements which guarded against physical deficiencies. And in fact, these guarantees were largely borne out in practice. It seems that this scheme contributed to the impressively small number of migrants rejected for medical reasons upon arrival in the United States, just 3% per annum after 1892. Yet, whilst outwardly a seemingly benevolent, albeit commercial initiative, by its very design and location, the Auswandererhallen also provided a means of continuing the enforced segregation of migrants from the wider German populace that had begun at the Prussian border. At the basic level, this was achieved by situating the complex on a site far removed from the town at a distance of approximately 3 miles. Here is a map showing Hamburg, and if you look right to the bottom of your slide, you can see there in red lettering the site of the Auswandererhallen. The complex also boasted its own train station from which migrants could directly disembark. Embarkation for their onward journey was also a very managed process. On the day of departure, migrants were accompanied as they walked to the tenders which transported them to the steamships which were moored at Cuxhaven at the mouth of the Elbe. The spatial situation of the site was then in part about maximising the convenience of accommodating migrants in close proximity to these points of arrival and departure. A second, arguably more important function of the Auswandererhallen was the role it played in placating Hamburg residents who feared the polluting effects of residing in close proximity to a potential source of infection. As one local resident confirmed in an interview with our British journalist Robert Sherrard in his series for the London Evening Standard, we saw a great danger in the neighbourhood of these people, and so we put the Ásvandara Hallan there, where the emigrants could be shipped off without touching the town. Unsurprisingly, Sherrard heartily endorsed the strategy to place in Hamburg this segregated idea of city and port, separating out the townspeople from these transient port dwellers, not least because it gave him yet another opportunity to drive home his now quite well-rehearsed argument about the paucity of similar precautions in Britain. There, unlike at the Hanseatic port, he claimed that a stodgy carelessness reigned supreme that enabled, again in quotes, the same kind of people which the citizens of Hamburg had learned to guard against, slip in. These elaborate precautions put in place to cleanse migrants repeatedly before they were permitted to enter Hamburg, and then again whilst residents at the Ásvandara Hallan appealed to Sherrard as a wholly understandable spatial arrangement to protect the city from the necessary but dangerous work undertaken at the port. So this complex then, with its modern and spacious facilities, able to accommodate at full capacity 1,500 migrants, and then as many as 5,000 migrants after the extension of the site in 1906, was useful in various regards to different groups and individuals, both domestic and foreign. For pro-restrictionist campaigners from Britain, such as William Evans Gordon, who visited the site during his 1902 continental tour, the impressive spectacle of modern medicalised efficiency provided yet another means to highlight the failings in Britain's own system of regulation and entry. And I quote, "It is clear that were it not for American legislation," he moaned, "the costly arrangements in place at the Ásvandara Hallan would not have been made by a commercial company." The 1891 Immigration Act in the United States, which placed the onus on steamship companies to ensure the solvency, morality and health of all migrants that it transported, invested the authorities at Ellis Island with the authority to force the return of any migrant seeking entry at the shipping company's expense. The lack of a similar deterrent at Britain's own port, Evans Gordon argued, was tantamount to denying ourselves the advantage of this invaluable safeguard against the importation of disease and the immigration of undesirables. This theme was also taken up by Robert Sherrard during his exhaustive tour of the facilities in January 1905. His reports stressed that whilst the Ásvandara Hallan offered considerable reassurance on the one hand as to the rigorousness and seriousness with which the authorities at Hamburg regarded the task of disease containment and elimination, its success also highlighted the perceived shortcomings at Britain's own ports of entry. To any English patriot, the journalist insisted, a visit to the various pavilions of the Emigrants' Hall is a painful and humiliating experience. He said, then, one sees splendid specimens here of men and women, Russians, Lithuanians, Hungarians, Slovenians, clean, sturdy, open-faced, sweet creatures. These for America and Canada to work in the fields, to work in the factories with their strong arms, clean hearts, to be put at the entire disposal of their new country. One sees too the very opposite of these, filthy, rickety jetsons of humanity, bearing on their evil faces the stigmata of every physical and moral degeneration. Men and women who have no intention of working otherwise than in trafficking. These are for England. And this was pure sensationalism. The stringency of the control measures in place at the Ásvandara Hallan made it all but impossible to be admitted to the site without undergoing some form of disinfection. Sidestepping the daily medical inspections was also a highly unlikely scenario, not only because of the system in place at the complex, but also because of the value increasingly attached to migrant health, not least by migrants themselves, as a passport necessary for entry into a new life. But for Sherrard, however, veracity in the reporting of the aliens question was an elastic concept to be pushed and pulled and reshaped to elicit shock and outrage, rather really than to alleviate anxieties. And achieving this was a sensory project as much as a discursive one. He repeatedly described for his readers the smell as well as the sights on display in this highly embellished version of the Auswandererhallen. Migrants were identified, he claimed, not just by appearance, but by smell. Whilst the brandy smell was indicative of labouring Christians for the New World, the pungent stench of garlic denotes the Israelites, of whom a proportion go to London. His association of the migrants' stench as a symptom of their humble origins, accentuated by a clearly discernible racial profile, reproduced quite clearly racist, imperialist stereotypes, which link defensive smells to primitive or uncivilized society. But his evocative sensory landscape was also a clever device deployed to draw his readers' attention once again to Britain as this vulnerable and powerless receptacle of substandard humanity. Whilst praise for this Hanseatic port was typically overflowing amongst British visitors to the city, its main rival in terms of accommodating and transporting migrant Jews enjoyed no such plaudits. And this is the port city of Libau. Again, a map here showing the town and the port. Located more than 1,000 kilometers northeast on the shores of the Baltic, this resided firmly both figuratively and literally inside the Russian Empire. As the 19th century drew to a close, Libau's prosperity and fame had grown as the newly elected site of a Russian naval base, an important global trading hub and a stepping off point for millions of migrants. Yet despite its indisputable commercial and military importance, its position on the fringes of the Russian Pale tainted its reputation as a town subject to the same backwardness which Western commentators had all too frequently attributed to Russia. Albert Kinross, a British Jew, a journalist, novelist, and short story writer, gleefully evoked these same associations when he travelled from the port into the city after arriving there in 1904. "Dear dirty Russia," he wrote, "there was no mistaking the unwashed face of that delectable land as a ramshackle cab took me from the harbour to the Hotel de Rome. Hovels and good brick houses, streets that began with a flourish and ended in a slum, a leisurely, curious people with no strict notion of cleanliness or propriety." No less an opportunist than Sherrard, Kinross recognised that the most salacious details about the city and its sizable transient migrant population would be found at the docks, and he quickly made his way there after arriving in the city, going first of all to the Exchange, where he found merchants, 70% of whom were Jews, dealing leisurely in produce, or stood at the counter of the tiny restaurant eating zuzika and smoking cigarettes. They were remote, outlandish folk, untravelled, devoted to their trade, careless about dress and appearances. They lived in wooden houses, overheated, ill-ventilated in winter, baking hot in summer, and slovenly at all times. These were the patricians of the place. And this is a rather unflattering image of Libau's mercantile community, presiding over by a lucrative international industry with quite a lazy and detached arrogance. You'd also throw into question, of course, the conditions at the port itself. What checks and balances were in place to regulate the quality of produce leaving and arriving if these dishevelled individuals were Libau's gatekeepers? Kinross has an answer for this too. Disease, he reported, especially smallpox, was common, and yet in keeping with this rather lackadaisical attitude of the merchants, No attempt at all was made to isolate the patient. Kinross's spurious presentation of conditions in Libau was sensationalist in tone, but in broaching this matter of port hygiene had alighted upon a distinctly topical concern. By the turn of the century, Libau, together with other Baltic ports, had developed a reputation for their relative laxity in the matter of disease prevention. This was especially controversial as migrant numbers passing through the port soared to become an export market as lucrative as the port's other staple trade in horses, eggs, and grain. However, unlike the strict regulations in place at the German border and at German ports, the Russian government did little to enforce a system of medical inspection and disinfection. This negligence, especially when viewed in the light of the devastatingly rapid mobility of diseases such as cholera when left unpoliced, became a key point of discussion for the United Kingdom's Royal Commission on Alien Immigration in 1903. As a member of the commission, Evans-Gordon was keen to press the point, asking Herman Landau, president of the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter in East London, to confirm that the medical examinations conducted at Libau were of a, and I quote, very, very sketchy character indeed. Dr. Herbert Williams, Chief Medical Officer for the Port of London, was also led to give his assessment to the Commission, reporting that migrants arriving from Libau were often crawling with body lice and generally in a very bad state. But worst of all was their smell, described almost as unbearable. It was such a smell that you would not like to travel in the same bus with these persons. It was a peculiar smell, a smell that I've never been able quite to find anything to compare with. These issues, William insisted, originated in the laxity of the boarding procedures at Libau, where Evans-Gordon himself confirmed to the Commission the medical examination really hardly exists. Instead, odours emitted by migrants were allowed to pollute the port before being transferred to the bowels of the steamship. Kinross, the journalist, declared that the stench began in the town itself, a smell town cleansed by the sea airs, but otherwise devoid of sanitation. Trans migrants became steeped in the odours of the place as they lodged in doss houses that even a flea would fight shy of. The paucity of facilities to accommodate trans migrants in Libau prior to their sea voyage certainly stood in sharp contrast to the modern complex at Hamburg, where a migrant's odour was systematically contained and then neutralised. Preventing the mixing of migrants with the wider population at Hamburg, and indeed throughout their transit through Germany, prevented pestilence from leaking out to contaminate the environments through which they journeyed. Libau's backwardness, therefore, was stark. The port's inability or unwillingness to segregate or eliminate disease, contaminants, and foul odours extended to the conditions found in the tween-decks accommodation of departing ships. William Evans-Gordon expressed derision over the rudimentary or even absent ventilation found on board, the paucity of sanitary arrangements, and the proximity in which migrants and animals were lodged. In a report submitted to the Port Sanitary Committee, Herbert Williams similarly confirmed that conditions for passengers who purchased the cheapest tickets to travel in steerage were little better than that enjoyed by the ponies. In lurid detail, Williams pointed to what he called the mobility of the ponies' emanations and odour, which were able to travel between berths, seeping through floorboards, or allowed to drip down through their hatchways into human sleeping quarters. Unsurprisingly, given their shared agenda to push for legislation to combat the arrival of diseased or dirty immigrants, Williams and Evans-Gordon both chose the very worst examples of steerage conditions to present to the Royal Commission. And these were found in the main on ships owned by the Danish company DFDS, a company beyond the jurisdiction, in fact, of Libau or indeed of Imperial Russia. However, Libau's reputation as the point of departure was tarnished nonetheless by association, becoming shorthand for alarmist examples of the health hazards posed by migrants, ostensibly Jews, travelling to Britain from the Baltic. So just to try and conclude then, shocking revelations about appalling sanitary arrangements and failing or absent inspection processes made ports like Libau easy to co-opt into the language of anti-alienism. Here was a site that erected few discernible barriers against the undesirable migrant. Moreover, and more worryingly still, far from filtering, containing, or decontaminating Europe's unwanted, the dilapidation of the town itself, as well as the degrading conditions found on board ships leaving its port, positioned it as an environment that appeared to incubate and propagate the worst type of alien Jew. This framing of Libau as not just a liminal space, but a leaky one, through which disorder in its myriad of human, microbe, and putrid forms flowed, played into discursive tussles over how and how far Britain's own ports needed to be fortified. However, it was the unmistakable figure of the Jew who resided at the heart of such debates. Even a decade after the Hamburg epidemic had subsided, anti-alien quarters of the British press still found mileage was to be had in referencing the association between Jewish migrants and disease. And just to leave you with this final image. The Daily Express in this cartoon went straight for the nation's jugular in a cartoon that pressed the point that it was not just the Russian frontier towns and German ports that lay in the path of cholera. Indeed, if the Daily Express was to be believed, there was little that separated these continental border zones from Britain's own maritime frontier. Not legislative blockages, far less a will to turn migrants away. This cartoon's grotesque caricature of Russian Jews arriving at British ports carrying suitcases, might be a bit small to see here, but marked microbes as well as dynamite, but still nonetheless welcomed by a simpering John Bull figure, was little more than a blunt instrument intended to hammer home a critique of Britain's woefully porous borders. Critically, however, Jews, especially the unknown quantity that was the alien Jew, remained the vehicle for this terrifying idea. As the London Government Board insisted at the height of the crisis, the danger was in the present instance greatly aggravated by the character of the people conveying the infection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was brilliant and beautifully delivered. So we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. Could I abuse the privilege of the chair and just ask you whether, on one level that you could say, well, there isn't because they're successful, but is there an alternative pro-alien discourse that also uses health and migration in favor of the Jewish immigrants?
Yes, and you'll know them well, I'm sure. Of course, there's been other writing about this, particularly after Jewish migrants arrive and become a more settled community in places like the East End. And we know that there's been work already done on the far superior record of infant mortality that's been identified in the alien Jewish community. Works around those kind of practices about the keeping of the home and arguably better or lower rates of disease transmission in the immigrant community as well in urban centres. So yes, I know that this paper probably paints one particular side of this picture about discourse around Jews and immigrants and health, and certainly it is more nuanced than that. Particularly, I think, what I've argued in the book that this comes from is that that debate becomes even more nuanced in many ways the closer that Jews are to Britain. So in fact, once they arrive in Britain and once they become settled in its various urban quarters, then suddenly there's a kind of an appreciation of the complexities of these Jewish families, of their setup, and a greater curiosity really about how they live, how their various practices potentially even provide something of a model for other urban communities. But I think when they are still at a distance, when they are still journeying, then anxiety is much more heightened around them, particularly when it comes to these moments of crises around disease and pandemics.
Okay, so Claire's just sent us a note saying either raise questions in the chat or raise your hand somehow, and we can, Claire, who is controlling everything behind the scenes, can release you to speak.
Hello, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I don't know how to raise my hand, virtual hand. That's why I just ask. I don't know, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, what was the accepted theory of transmission at that time? That,
yeah. Sorry, go on.
It was just a sort of, you know, migration that was responsible for transmission of epidemics.
Mm. Well, of course, this is a moment as well towards the late 19th century when germ theory is coming to the fore and overtaking from miasma, this theory of transmission through polluted air. But I think it was interesting, hopefully you got the impression from some of the sort of more juicy quotations that I pulled out, that there was still very much a concern with the odour, the smell of migrants, and that was potentially a source of contamination too. So in the 19th century is critical as a moment when the science certainly starts to change around understanding of disease transmission, but how far that is actually penetrating into popular understanding, I think, is more questionable. And I think you can certainly see that here in this particular case study. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, apparently he was. They took miasma pretty much responsible for that because of smell and you know, but also touch. I mean, how do you say, contagiousness also apparently, because it's not clear there, because they accuse I mean Jewish population of migration, I mean being responsible of contaminating. I mean this amounts to accepting this idea of contagious, while miasma is not the idea of contagious. So apparently it was not very clear what was the dominant theory. I mean, yes, I mean, the germ theory was at that time, but still, yeah. And then also my other question would be, what about other migrant population? I mean, did they also talk about that, if I followed well, or just the Jewish population?
Yeah, I mean, certainly other migrant populations were quite commonly linked with disease as well. The Irish were often brought into these kind of debates and this sort of rhetoric, and held to be responsible for spreading all manner of things. I think, I mean, in this particular example, I think the Jews were particularly sort of seized upon, given their sizable numbers at this time, that they were the most high profile migrants traveling through these kind of routes. And so that was particularly common. But of course, if you just look at the records, we all know at Ellis Island, how the processing, the sort of the filtering, the processing, the inspection of migrants was often designed to target particular groups considered to be particularly susceptible to certain diseases too. And much of this, of course, playing on this kind of, sort of very questionable race science and what certain groups were perceived to be more susceptible to.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions come in on the chat. First from Elizabeth Jenkinson. She asked, what happened to the people who weren't admitted into a country where they returned to their country of origin? What happened to them then? If a family was traveling and one person was ill, would they all return or just the person who was ill? So that's...
Yeah, it was quite terribly, it was down to the individual family generally to make that decision. Of course, the person that had been identified as being the carrier of the disease could not pass, would not be admitted, either through the border, through the checkpoints, through any of these facilities, and certainly not on board these ships. But the rest of the family could, in theory, but it was ultimately up to families to decide if they would continue on or if they would all go back. And this could be really heartbreaking. We can see from some of the records that we still have, often those that were kept by some of the various Jewish charities that assisted these migrants as they travelled, that families were often quite literally torn in half. Particularly if it involved children or young people that were considered to be the carrier of the disease, that they would have to make that decision, should they all turn back. But of course, that would be a huge cost, and often it was a sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity to make that journey. So should they all go back and perhaps never have the opportunity again to depart, or should they carry on but without that person, or even try to chance their luck and find if there was some other way, or perhaps even a more welcoming or a less sort of well-regulated country perhaps that they could travel to. Hence all that sort of rhetoric that I was trying to pull out, this idea that Britain was a soft touch and that diseased migrants might be able to be admitted there even if they couldn't get into somewhere like the United States.
Thank you. And another question from Ilja Lenskis. Thank you for a great lecture. Do we know something of Evans' whereabouts in Russia, particularly in Libau, except for his own reports? Did he meet local Russian, Baltic, German officials, representatives of the Jewish charitable organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish leaders, police?
That's a good question, actually. And I have to say, I don't know. I don't know if Tony will know or if somebody else in the lecture will know more about that. I have read his account, obviously, that comes out of his fully published account. And of course, as well, there are references to his journey through some of our the governmental records, the Royal Commission on Alien Immigration and others. But quite rightly, yes, this all does come from his point of view. And in terms of actually verifying that, that's harder to pin down. I haven't looked at papers, I haven't seen papers that verify from another perspective his particular journey. So I'd be interested to know if there are some.
And there are no private papers, so we know not a great deal about him really, other than from his work in the public sphere. So, but yes, I think be very right to be very cautious of his very partial view.
Yeah.
And I think, as with the other people you mentioned, they are finding what they want to find of what are very complicated situations. So we still have time for more questions and comments if people would like to.
Can I ask one then?
Sure.
It reminded me of, Yiddish literature, and in particular Sholem Aleichem and Motto, Cantor's son, and how, well, he describes, of course, the anxiety of migrants in Hamburg in particular, and a lot of the anxiety was about glaucoma, being diagnosed with glaucoma. So I just wonder if it's something that is completely made up in the mythology, or if they were really looking for glaucoma and it was a big thing.
I think they were looking for it, certainly. I mean, that was the disease that I'd generally heard of as well. But interestingly, you're right. I think you can read about it also through other Jewish literary accounts. I think in Israel Zangwill, there's this wonderful short story where he talks about one family that probably chimes in a little bit with the earlier question, one Jewish family that make it all the way in sight of the Statue of Liberty. And then I think the daughter is diagnosed with that when they are landed, and so the whole family has to turn around, and then there's this heartbreaking scene of them seeing the Statue of Liberty receding behind them as they have to travel home again, and this just utterly heartbreaking. But it was the great fear, obviously the great fear, the great anxiety that one of your family members might be struck down. And I mean, how far was it a myth? I don't know. I think certainly there's been work to show that lots of these narratives around Jewish migration, these moments of arrival, and how migrants came to get to where they went to, how far some of this is based on certain sort of myths that serve convenient truths, but certainly yes, I think we can't get around the fact that from the 1890s onwards, it was incredibly hard for migrants to travel without undergoing any of these inspections, and to be confident that they would simply be admitted at their intended point of destination. And it must have always been a concern, that even if you didn't leave, even if you left being healthy, would you actually make it to the end point of your journey and remain so?
And just to add to that, there does seem to be a particular obsession with eye disease, even though most of these, like trachoma, they're infectious, but they're not particularly major. Obviously, they're unfortunate, but it does become a sort of moral panic. There's an article which I wish I'd sort of have written, just because of the wonderful title of The Eyes Have It, on anti-alienism. But it does become the focal point of parts of the body become the most dangerous one. There's a new question coming in. This is like the football scores in the 1970s coming through on a teleprinter. Stockport County have lost again in the last minute. Jean-Louise Weinstein asks, do we know if records were destroyed or lost during the Second World War to trace families?
Yes, most certainly they would have been. It's not something I know a great deal about in any detail, but I think it goes without saying that certainly there would have been huge numbers of records lost that would have told us more, certainly from the perspective of the migrants themselves, and actually uncovering the migrant voice is difficult. And there has been some records, again, particularly those that were kept by certain charity organisations, particularly Jewish charities that assisted migrants in these journeys, and we can still see those, read those. On the other side of things, if you look at the various port authorities in Hamburg and even in Libau, I think that's more tricky to find things. I was at the Emigrants Museum. It's now a museum, what was formerly this Auswander Hallen. And although they do have some records, even they, of course, face challenges as a result of the Second World War, and have lost some records, and also just a non-appreciation, really, that this later on would be considered valuable and of value, telling the story of these emigrants. And so you know, they've had to work to piece this story together somewhat too.
And I do think sort of digitization and the have just made, and I've written some stuff about very obscure transmigrants, and so many of their relatives have been in touch through digitization, but just so many different sources, which has worked against the destruction of records. Question from Kendrick Oliver, whoever he is. Hi, Hannah. I was wondering about the role of gender in these debates and the level of intimacy and intrusion in inspection regimes. Was there any sense in which medical inspection regimes were designed in part to deter migration as distinct from policing it?
Sorry, what was the last bit of that, Tony?
I'll read that last sentence again. Was there any sense in which medical inspection regimes were designed in part to deter migration as distinct from policing it?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you, Kendrick. Where to go with that? Yes, absolutely. I think there's an element in which it was also a deterrent. The British were keen to sort of jump on the bandwagon of how efficient the Germans had been over this, trying to make use of press as well to sort of advertise the fact that this was going to be a very hard process for migrants. And so they should be wary, hoping that would act as a deterrent, not least because this is all a time before the Aliens Act has passed. And so there isn't a sort of a meaningful barrier, let's say, against Jews entering Britain. So if they can get some mileage out of reporting the stringency of the regulations on the continent, then that would work in their favour. In terms of gender, I think that's a really interesting angle. It's not really one I've thought about too much. When I first conceived this project, I was quite concerned with thinking through gender, but I quite quickly came to see that trying to get at that question of gender when thinking about the journey was more tricky. I mean, even piecing together what we know now about these migrant journeys is sort of hard enough in its own right. I mean, the few scraps, I suppose, that I have come across that have made me think about gender a little bit is the presentation that you sometimes get of Jewish women, Jewish children as migrants. They maybe unsurprisingly are presented in a much more sympathetic light, perhaps as somewhat pathetic and worthy of our sympathy as onlookers when their journey and how difficult it is presented in the press and through these other forms. Perhaps the Jewish man is presented in in a much more sort of stereotypically sort of anti-Semitic ways, being more sort of culpable and complicit in conspiratorial acts to cross borders, and these kind of ideas perhaps as being the more likely carriers of contagion even as well. But it's something that I haven't, as I say, looked into in a great amount of detail. And I think certainly trying to look at it from the British point of view, looking at the record, at the presentation of these Jewish journeys, it would be quite hard, I think, to tease out meaningfully too much in terms of differentiation between these migrants based on gender.
Thank you. This question from Anushka Alexander Rose. In addition to the association you made with Eugene Sue, was the Wandering Jew used as a specific motif in press of the time as a depiction of the alien/disease Jew?
Well, I've argued in this book that I published that yes, it was. Although again, you sort of have to look quite hard to see it, but I think yes, very much so. Not least because it's the best known example, let's say, to British audiences of the mobile Jew, let's say. And I think it does start appearing, particularly after, I think, the publication of Eugene Sue's novel in mid-century. which does quite a lot really to bring the term and the legend of the wandering Jew back into the lexicon of English language and culture. It sort of revives it, let's say, for a new audience. So I think it's sort of before the British public, and then on the heels of that, you've got this mass migration of Jews who are also, on the move. And I think that it becomes quite an important motif for sowing the seeds of anxiety about exactly what Jewish mobility really means. That if you've got the wandering Jew who is roaming the earth, particularly if this is a wandering Jew who is a diseased Jew, then you somehow have this kind of echo, this parallel almost in these migrating Jews who are also coming at a time of anxiety around disease and disease prevention and disease management. Somehow seems to be this metaphor. You do see the term itself coming up from time to time in some of the writing about these immigrants. Also, interestingly, from an Anglo-Jewish perspective, again, Israel Zangwill uses the term from time to time to refer to these migrants. So I think that's quite interesting. As well as at one point, in fact, trying to also sort of challenge the idea about these Jews coming in and what it means for immigration restrictions, saying that it's these wandering Jews who are causing us the biggest headache, effectively. So I paraphrase, but he actually uses the term wandering Jew as a sort of a catch-all term to refer to this alien immigrant community.
Thank you. Just a note of thanks from Matthias Seiter, name from the past.
Thank you for coming.
And we have our one quota of one question from a Leicester City fan tonight. So Brian Chayette asks, great paper, Hannah. How important were these questions of disease and migration to the Alien Commission? Was there significant pushback to the anti-alienists?
So how important were they in terms of the Royal Commission on Alien Immigration?
How important were questions of disease and migration to the Alien Commission? So, yeah.
Yes.
And then was there significant pushback to the anti-alienists?
Yeah, so I think these questions were pretty important. Or, I mean, what I'm trying to argue in this paper ultimately is that the restrictionists, those in favour of anti-alien legislation, used it to help build their case. It was just one more very potent, very powerful platform for trying to build a case against immigration, unrestricted immigration. And that the journey was a really important site, a really important space in which they could make the most of this as an opportunity. That it provided all manner of scenarios that could be made to seem really terrifying, particularly when it came to disease. If you have this notion of disease quite literally coming ever closer to Britain's shore, just as the migrants themselves are, that this sort of notion of proximity to disease is a really terrifying one that gets used. But yeah, I mean, in terms of pushback, I think there is pushback. I think there is an attempt by the more moderate voices sitting on that Royal Commission to try to temper some of this, to try to get behind the headlines and, how far is this really the case? And you do have them challenging, this presentation you'd get of somewhere like Liebau and saying, well, how far is this really the fault of the port? And actually is it down to this one Danish shipping line? And if we try to regulate that, you do see changes coming in on the back of some of this. So in Liebau by about 1907, 1908, they're starting to go slightly more the way of Hamburg. They have a designated emigrants accommodation block. They have also their own sort of slightly more rudimentary system of inspection. So yes, I mean, things develop and there is a response to all of this. You could argue that you know, that's the pushback, which shows the other side of all of this story, and begins to work to help to build a more meaningful defence of these immigrants and how culpable they really are for the spread of disease.
Thank you. And I think what may possibly be our last question from Rafael Jimenez. Thanks you for excellent paper. He says, I'm researching about the city in Gypsies Roma people in Spain, where he finds many similarities. My question is, in reference to pointing out with disease, how far ethnicity was a scapegoat that concealed reality that also affected other non-stigmatized groups such as Jews or Gypsies?
Yes, I mean, quite clearly here, a lot of these debates are underscored by racism, by a pre-existing racist rhetoric that is being invoked here to try to sell a particular image, a particular notion of culpability. And I mean, that's why it's important to think, of course, as one of the other early questions asked, about how other groups are brought into this and the particular associations that are conjured up about them as well, that all of this very much depends on these kind of pre-existing ideas and how they can be drawn upon. It would be interesting to know in your research, you know, what you're actually finding, if there are particular diseases or particular I don't know, particular scenarios, particular crimes, particular things that are attributed to the Roma community, just as they are in this case attributed to Jews, but ultimately how that kind of starts to change over time, and I think also over space as well. So in what different spaces and in what different places do these kind of associations start to emerge, and you know, how can we try to understand their existence? So sorry, that's a bit of a woolly answer, but it's a shame we're not all there in person. It would be interesting to talk about these things in comparison.
Oops, a new one is coming in. I was like, oh, he just says thank you very much. So, okay, I think we will close it there. I'm going to pass on to Claire in a minute to tell us about forthcoming events, but thank you very much, Hannah. It's been brilliant to have you, even if virtually. Yeah, a fantastic paper, and we will bring you back in person soon, hopefully.
I would love that. I would love that. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation and for all the wonderful questions as well. Thank you.
Yes.